Good afternoon, everyone from Chile, Cambridge, and welcome to our webinar on sustainable value creation through industrial symbiosis. We are here today with my colleague, Dr. Karen Miller, and we will share with you some of the more interesting findings from our 3 years worth of work on the SCALER project. And I'll explain more about the SCALER project and the kind of work and research we did. Let's get into our session. Like I said, SCALER is a European project that we have been working on for the past 3 years. It's part of the European Union SPIRE program, and it is focused on understanding and scaling industrial symbiosis in the European process industry. So an overview for the project is what you can see next. Like I said, our focus was understanding how we can scale up industrial symbiosis in the process industry, but the learnings that we acquired can very much translate into other industries and other beyond process industries, fields that can benefit from understanding industrial symbiosis, which is fundamental to understanding circular economy. So the partners in the project are listed, and apart from us, the University of Cambridge, we also worked with a research institute in Portugal, ISQ, Strain Innovation, our French partner, Quantish from Switzerland, and EIT Climate Kick were all part of this consortium that really, in our view, did an amazing job of pulling together a very comprehensive body of knowledge on industrial symbiosis, which tackles both the technical side of industrial symbiosis, but also understanding other challenges around setting up business models and engaging with stakeholders and what kind of policy and standards might be needed in order to scale up industrial symbiosis. So you will see that part of our engagement, stakeholder engagement, is the webinar that is taking place now. Our other partners held a similar webinar on their work earlier this morning, and we will also share the link to their webinar afterwards. We held a few workshops, and some are still scheduled to be run in a few countries. Some of you may have attended our SCALER workshop earlier this year, and part of your contribution is what we've also taken into consideration. There will be a final event, which we call Innovation Camp, at the end of October, where we want to disseminate even wider the findings from the project. So moving on, just to give you an overview of what we were interested in understanding. And for those of you familiar or not so familiar with industrial symbiosis, we wanted to take a systemic approach and understand it from multiple perspectives and lenses. And I will explain how we took industrial symbiosis and what lens of analysis we adopted and what broad definition we used in order to have a useful view of what it is and how it can help other businesses and industries in taking it up. So we really looked across a range of issues, like I said, from financing to behaviors and production system technologies, business models, etc. And we'll give you some highlights from our findings today. Moving on to what we did look specifically, and again, these are headlines, but on our project website, there are very thorough and comprehensive resources that you can really dig deeper into any of these issues. around industrial symbiosis. So for those of you who are really into the trenches, or for those of you who want to understand better what it is, it's so suitable for all of you to go and have a read. But let's share some of our content that we created during this project. So just to get everyone on the same page with us, is starting with how we define industrial symbiosis for the sake of this project, but also in a way that actually it is useful in order to transfer the findings to other industries and to businesses of different sizes. So the way we define industrial symbiosis is really through the lens of resource synergies, which we took as the unit of analysis for industrial symbiosis in SCALER. And resource synergies are defined as the exchange or sharing of tangible, physical, or intangible resources. So tangible resources being energy, water, recycled materials, infrastructure, and intangible being different services like sharing, transportation, or training, or other services between different industrial processes and partners from different sectors. So this is really exchange and sharing of tangible and intangible resources between partners who have different processes because they come from different sectors. And we wanted to understand how industrial symbiosis can facilitate the creation of sustainable value, meaning environmental, social, and economic benefits together by utilizing these resource synergies, or by creating new resource synergies. So how do we increase the business opportunities between the different sectors? How do we create new jobs? How do we become more productive? How do we reduce waste? And all of these benefits that come out of industrial symbiosis. So moving on to how actually that can be done. At this point, I will hand over the microphone to my colleague Karen, and she will really walk you through some of the interesting findings that emerged from this work. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Doroteya. So just to start off, what's really important is to understand, obviously building on what Doroteya has talked about, was our aim. So here we're going to be looking very specifically at what were the best practices, and also we've added in another section which came really to the fore in terms of our research, which was the role of what we term intermediaries. And I'm going to speak a little bit in more detail about that a little bit further on within the seminar. So the most important thing was about providing support for self-organized arrangements for industrial symbiosis. But obviously we had to take a sort of much broader approach in terms of our research. So I'm just going to sort of follow this part and just talk a little bit about our research strategy that we used. So on the first part, I'm going to be talking about more specifically, we're going to have a real look at the triggers, barriers, and enablers, as we've termed them. And we used 25 cross-industry case studies, which we drew from a very broad range of industries and geographical locations and different levels of maturity of industrial symbiosis. So from very nascent, very small systems up to very well-established ones, which in some cases have been going for something like 40, 50, 60 years. And the second part, which is the section on the intermediaries, we did a very systematic literature review of the state of the art of industrial symbiosis. And we looked at 210 different articles and reports. So these were all peer-reviewed articles and papers between the period of 2016 to 18. So we can just look here at this map. It just shows where these 25 case studies were drawn from. This just shows a small example of those. You can see it sort of basically spans most of the globe. There were some very particular areas, obviously, that have been written about a lot more than others. So within the UK, there's been quite a lot of research done, as indeed there has been in places like Denmark, or studies of Denmark, and also in places such as China. And again, we'll come back to why China is very important later on in this webinar. But also, obviously, there's a European project. There were a lot of research papers and information and data that came from Europe more specifically as well. So Doroteya and I developed this analytical framework. This was built on other scholars' work, because this helped us to organise the way that we thought about analysing the literature, and also it gave us a way to think about how we then provided the information in a very accessible way. So this is why it's really important that you do then go back and read the various reports and look at the website, as Doroteya has already mentioned. So as you can see here, there are the three elements. So the triggers, so these are basically like the sparks that set industrial symbiosis into action. The enablers, so this we would term as a bit like the fuel that's added to once the spark has lit the fire. And then obviously there were barriers, which we also felt were really important to cover. So the most important thing here to think about is that the enablers and barriers are a bit like two sides to one coin. So you can take one side, the enablers, and you could flip it over and you can see what the barriers are. And you'll see this in the slides that follow on from here. But first off, we're going to just look at the triggers for industrial symbiosis. So obviously there are an awful lot of triggers that were found. Again, all of the detail is captured within our reports. So we're just going to highlight the most important of these in this webinar. So in terms of the headline ones, probably the most important was the need to respond to the Paris Accord. So in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions from previous levels to the goal, which is the 2030 goal, by 40%. So this we found was a very powerful driver across lots of different of the case studies. And obviously you can see that this has a trickle down effect, which again, we're going to pick up on a little bit later in this webinar. So the second point is really around the fact that systems have started to flourish because firms and governments and regional authorities all recognise that there are economic benefits that flow directly from industrial symbiosis. So some of these are very straightforward. So some of it is around reducing the high levels of cost to get rid of what previously would be called waste, because it now becomes a byproduct as a feed material into another industry. And also sometimes it was around the ability to innovate and come up with more effective processes, and therefore this fed through into greater profitability. So I'm obviously not going to read through all of these points because there's probably too many to really touch upon here. But one of the other in point E that was really, really key was this need to respond to environmental problems. So this was particularly seen in some of the case studies. So I'll just pick out two of those. The one that affected the Taranto region in Italy, where levels of pollution were so high that basically they'd had to cut back on their production within the area because of the high levels of heavy metals and water pollution that had resulted as over a period of time that had to be dealt with. And the second one really comes through from China, where companies there had been basically polluting the environment and had been told or mandated by the Chinese government, and therefore they had no choice but to take action. So we can see that there are multiple reasons why companies are triggered into taking action, and why, again, this comes back to this sort of waterfall effect that we see heading down from something like the Paris Accord and a sort of international framework all the way through down to a firm level. So then to think about the industrial symbiosis enablers. So one of our most important findings was that these were centred around highly social elements. So these were particularly around trust. So trust is absolutely an essential component within industrial symbiosis, because otherwise companies don't want to connect with each other. It's really, really important because they have to be able to share detailed information in order to be able to exchange resources. Also around the nature of communication, where people had to trust what other parties were saying. And so we can see that this becomes a key element within successful industrial symbiosis and within successful systems that have already been set up. So you can see this links directly onto the second point, because this is how successful and strong social networks become developed. In some instances, they would start off with just very simple conversations between people who already knew each other, as in cases in Denmark, for example, and they then began to build from that. So if two people met, they then introduced other people into the conversation, and therefore it started off a sort of seeding process across various industries. So on the third point down, which is another one of our major findings, is the role of what we term knowledge creation and coordination bodies. So particularly through the intermediaries and specific knowledge agencies. So for example, universities become very important enablers of industrial symbiosis, because of the fact that they not only study these systems and therefore they spread knowledge of them, but also they're finding solutions to some of the problems that prevent these systems from starting up or from prospering once they have done. So I've already touched upon the need for the economic benefits, but I'd like to really focus on the need for political instruments in here. So this came through again as a very strong point, probably less so than the social elements, but in terms of things which were overarching enablers, the role of central governments really comes to the fore. And therefore, this is something we're going to come back to later on in this webinar with our recommendations for policymakers. So obviously there were other things which were very straightforward. These were around geographic proximity and also things such as commercial proximity. So where maybe companies weren't located next to each other, but they had a need, for example, to set up some type of exchange. This, for example, happened in Scotland, where it was worthwhile transporting materials because the cost of the waste process, or getting rid of the waste process, was so prohibitive that it was worth actually sending materials several hundred miles in order for them to become a valuable input material for another manufacturer. And then just moving down this list, we see the role of collaboratory platforms. We did a lot of work, which we won't be touching on here in terms of some of the types of technology and platforms. There's a lot more detail that's written up in our reports, so we would definitely encourage you to look at that. We did a whole section in terms of understanding how they operate. And then finally, moving down to the last 2 points, there's a really essential part around having very specific measurement and indicators and tools that allow companies to understand how much material and the value of what they are exchanging. And again, we'll come to some of the recommendations later on in the webinar when we talk more specifically around this. And then our final point was around the technology. And this really gets picked up on not only here in the enablers, but also in some of the barriers, which I'm going to turn to next. So in terms of the major barriers, so once again, there are many more barriers which we found in our research, but these really are the ones that we picked out as being the most salient in terms of this webinar. So the most fundamental of these is that the current market for waste is just not fully and sufficiently developed. So quite often there's an awful lot of waste that companies just don't know about. They don't know where to find out about it, and they don't know what type of waste is available. So this is a really important point, and again we'll come back to this at the end in terms of our recommendations. So the second point really is around not having the correct technology and data. So very specific technology, for example, is needed in certain instances, because to understand how to use one type of byproduct as an input material into another industry, sometimes it's not very straightforward at all. So for example, the use of stainless steel slag to be converted into use in cement making appears very straightforward, but in fact it's technically extremely difficult to do. And then the third point here really sort of underlines what I've already talked about, which is this the central role of government. So, for example, that we found a lot of cases where there was regulation which was not really fit for purpose. Sometimes a material would be classed as a waste, when in fact it should have been classed as a byproduct, so it could become used as an input material. And because, for example, it had been classed as waste material, it was prohibited from use. So sometimes one of the things that became an enabler, for example, was where waste would get reclassified. And that often came down to the role that was played by the intermediaries, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So we can see that a lot of these things become very complicated, and they're highly interconnected across all of our three sets of triggers, enablers and barriers, and also the role of the intermediaries. So the fourth point on this list is around the length of time that it takes to recoup quite often very high levels of investment that are needed. And we also found within our research the central role of what happened when there's a business as usual mindset. So this becomes very, very difficult to shift in a lot of instances, because it's simply cheaper and easier for companies to continue to do more of the same than have to shift their business model and their processes towards a more circular one. And again, that's something that needs to be shifted in future. I've already talked about the role of trust, so I won't touch upon that again here. But the final point in this is that we found there were multiple tools and platforms that have been developed, and indeed there are multiple types of other technologies that have been developed, but many of these are very untested. So for example, they might have been set up through research in one particular industrial symbiosis system, but were never then expanded to be used in any others. And furthermore, one of the other problems, or more main problems that we found, was a lot of these tools and platforms, they had been set up, but they then became unsupported. So effectively they were shut down, and then no one could ever access them or use them from that point on. So we had a sort of logic that emerged from our research. And so you can see I've already touched upon part of this in what I've already talked about. But we really found there was a very complicated interplay between these four levels. Obviously, at national government level, this was around effective regulation and sort of setting out frameworks and taxation systems. And that also came into play at a regional and local government and city level as well. So there are players here that play a very fundamental role in terms of acting as really important mobilizers of industrial symbiosis systems, as indeed there are at network and the eco-industrial park level, which is the second one from the bottom. And so our logic was really around understanding how these all, there was activity that acted effectively as a waterfall between them, and right the way down to a firm level. So just moving on from that, we're going to now move to our recommendations for policy. So first off, as you can probably already tell, and many of you will probably already know if you were involved in not only industrial symbiosis, but in the circular economy, this is a very, very complicated subject, and it needs to be extremely well coordinated, because you have multiple different stakeholders who all have their own agendas. And this is really important that policymakers take a very direct lead in terms of pushing this and driving it. And this is something that needs to happen on a long-term scale. So we can see, for example, the role that China has played, the Chinese government has played, and we, from our research, found that they, in fact, are one of the most, they're probably leading the field in terms of the way that they approach this. Obviously, they have certain parts of their system, because of the way that they're set up, where they're able to just define policy and everyone within the country will follow it. But we can see how powerful and how effective that has been. And we feel that that's something that would be an important lead for other countries, both within Europe and across the world, to follow on from. So the second point, which again is really major, is the need for standardization across Europe and potentially across the whole of the world. And this really should follow on from the format that's used in the food industry, where the EU set up standardized food processes and practices so that there could be sharing of information. So it makes it very, very simple. What we found from our research was there was very little in terms of commonality, and this added to the level of complexity for firms and industrial parks trying to be set up and trying to exchange materials between themselves. So I've already talked on the third point around the need for support. So it's not just at national government level, but also at national, regional levels, and also the need for investment at these levels too. There have been some very, very successful cases at city level, for example, in Sweden, which have really taken the lead, and they've really come to the fore in terms of what they've delivered in terms of industrial symbiosis. And the fourth point in here is that the metrics that are used and the targets need to be set, and these need to be used constantly and on a way so there's set a benchmark at the outset so that progress can be tracked and monitored over time. So this is very important in terms of addressing the Paris Accord, for example, so that we can really see that there's clear progress being made. So the recommendations for business really are first and foremost the need for very strong leadership and management, and a really strong commitment to shift from the business as usual mindset, which is very, very prevalent across all of Europe and potentially across most of the world, because the current business as usual mindset, as we all know, is fundamentally unsustainable, and it needs to be moved at great speed, particularly in the current climate, with the need to respond to the Paris targets, which are becoming, used to be a long time into the distance, but now becoming, moving into the foreground for us all. So in terms of businesses, this really also relies on having long-term strategies. And the point here is that these need to start off with very minor, very small scale first steps, because this gives the company more confidence to be able to move at higher speed. And by doing this, they can start to build the capacity in-house, and also recognise what they then need to do in terms of finding external support mechanisms to help them. So for this, what we also recommend is that there's a need to set up a dedicated function within a firm, because this is not about something that can just be given to someone or a small team on an ad hoc basis, because that will not deliver what is needed in the short, and certainly not in the longer term. So I'm now going to move on to the second part, which is around the intermediaries and what we've termed the change and knowledge agencies. So you can see on the right-hand side of the image, you can see we've still got this four-level diagram. So you can see that we've got these different levels from national government down to the firm level. But we also found that there were change agencies which were embedded within each of these. So, for example, in national government, in some countries, there's a whole department or ministry that is embedded within this. Quite often at a regional, local government level, there would again be people who were, that was part of their role, was to see that they were coordinating what activities were happening. And certainly at a network or EIP level, there were definitely functions within these structures. So what we have done here is we really found that intermediaries, so we would use the example of the NISP in the UK as a prominent example of this, that they were set up as a specific organisation in order to encourage industrial symbiosis. So these are highly, highly skilled people who are set up within a team, and their job is to establish a coordinatory function which sets up to understand what the needs are within a certain region, and they therefore are able to garner support and set up skills sessions, communicate, teach people, and also solve problems. So, for example, within the NISP team, there would be people such as specialist chemists who would be working on particular aspects, legal specialists who would be looking at contractual issues, for example. So we see that they're very, very important. So we can see here, and again, looking at the diagram on the right, that the most important function that they play is that they allow knowledge to be shared both vertically, so from between the 4 levels here, but also horizontally across regions. And the last part really that we felt was important was around what we've termed the knowledge agencies, which really are around, actually not just universities, there are other very specialist technical agencies who again are able to work on more technical aspects, deliver new innovation, for example, which provide ways to encourage and enable uptake and the prospering of industrial symbiosis. So in terms of our recommendations for policy in relation to the intermediaries and the knowledge agencies, we really feel that there's an ongoing need to really think about how there is investment in the intermediaries. So for example, in the UK, although the government set up the intermediaries, the NISP, they then disbanded it, and it then became a privately run function. So we feel that that was actually an error to have done that, because of the incredible effect, very positive effect that the NISP had had. So we can see that for policymakers, this is a really important process to think about how there's a knitting together of agencies and the universities, and actually putting proper funding and mechanisms into this. So I'll now hand back to Doroteya.
Thank you, Karen. And like we said, these are just highlights from very comprehensive reports that I've given you the links to in the chat box, but we can also email those to you in the follow-up email. What the project has also produced is turning this comprehensive work into more accessible quick guides and instructions, where you can download this again from the project website, and share freely within your organization or with partners, regardless of where you are on this journey. I'm sure you will find useful information in a way that is very accessible to have these conversations, so that you don't speak a technical language only, but you also engage people beyond the industrial symbiosis network into this conversation. So we have the quick guides. If we move on to the next slide, we also have a short form of what was a very in-depth analysis of the most promising synergies that some of our partners did, and it will also you can find our findings there, what the project found to be promising synergies that will generate significant impact, and also create sustainable value for the business and the network, and also society and environment. Like we said, we have ambitious targets to meet. Moving on to the last bit, of course, everyone is always curious, what's the size of the prize if this were to happen? And these are some assessments and evaluations that were done in the project that just illustrate the impact and really the value, economic but also otherwise, in terms of creating new jobs that could be achieved if the 100 shortlisted synergies were to be implemented at scale in Europe. So this is just the scale of the opportunity that we are talking about. when we consider scaling industrial symbiosis massively. I think that concludes our presentation for today. We have time to take some questions. Hopefully we'll be able to answer to the best of our knowledge. I would like to start with some pre-submitted questions because some of you did submit questions when you registered. And we have 2 pre-submitted questions. The first one is, what information do consuming industries need to be able to make the best material choices from a sustainability point of view? And that's a really good question. How do we choose the materials? You know, where is the impact from sustainability point of view? And I think what I just shared as the 100 promising synergies is the place that I would refer you to look more in depth into what we consider to be the most promising synergies. That involves the type of materials and also technology to implement that industrial symbiosis. So there isn't a short answer. It really you have to make an assessment based on your position, but also we can give you some guidance in terms of what we found to be the 100 most promising synergies. So the next pre-submitted question is, how do producers and consumers of materials share knowledge to encourage the uptake of secondary recycled materials when they have different processes and production requirements? Again, another really good question. And we did say that industrial symbiosis is about resource synergies between different processes and different industries. So how do we get that knowledge and how do we find our partners? And we did mention that we created a list basically of such platforms and knowledge sharing places where you can go and explore and look for that. This is going beyond the social element of where people share knowledge. But also very importantly, what we found in the most successful case studies of industrial symbiosis was the role of the intermediary as bringing the knowledge, so being the knowledge expert, but also being able to find the knowledge that you need. So engaging with an intermediary, or if you are an intermediary yourself, then that could be part of the services you may want to offer in your network. And again, we have some resources in our reports that I linked in earlier of what is out there. Like we said, not all of them are supported or complete, but we have tried to sift out the ones that are not in function or that seem out of date. So that will be a starting point of finding. And it is a frustration that, like we said, there isn't a shared and regulated waste market that people can really engage with and understand where there is waste and what type of waste is available and what they can do with that waste, or whether they can engage in a process of industrial symbiosis. So there's lots of challenges to be resolved around this, but there's also a lot of knowledge now that can be tapped into, especially if you're already involved in this process, that you can utilize. And we've tried to make things very accessible for people who are in this space or want to enter the space of industrial symbiosis. So these were the 2 pre-submitted questions. I can see we have 3 questions in the Q&A section. Just to remind everyone that if you want to submit a question, please submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen so that we are able to actually find it, rather than in the chat box where we have different types of messages going on. So the first question I can hand over to Karen. I think it's a choice.
Yeah, so the first question was in the Q&A relates to the lack of knowledge, which acts as a barrier to industrial symbiosis. So do we have Any examples? Well, in fact, there are lots and lots of examples that we found in our research. So the lack of knowledge really quite often comes back to this point about at a firm level, this is around the need, because companies quite often just want to continue to operate the business as usual. So they don't go out and seek the knowledge to be able to understand, because quite often they have what they would think about as a waste product. They just want to get rid of it the cheapest and easiest way possible, and they don't really think that there's someone out there who can take that as a byproduct, as a valuable input material into their production processes. So the thing with the lack of knowledge is it really, because industrial symbiosis is a bit like the circular economy, is only really kind of coming into the sort of mindset of lots more people actually quite recently. So when we looked at the literature, for example, although a lot of the literature does go back quite a long way, it's actually become a much sort of what we would term a hotter topic now. And we just think because there's so much more of a drive towards the need to respond to climate change, for example, that people now are more prepared to go out and think about, you know, where do I need to go and find this information from? And sometimes it's not very easy to find the information, which again, you know, I feel we've actually done a very comprehensive piece of work, and would really point you towards the materials to read them and look at how some of these some of the barriers have been overcome. And again, going back to the role of the intermediaries, they do play, and the universities play a really important part in terms of how to shift from current practice to a way that we need to now move towards. So hopefully that's answered that. If I haven't answered your question, by the way, please retype in it to ask another part of that question. The second question, Dan, I'm just looking at this. Is that more your question, do you think, Doroteya? This is around reclassification of waste.
I will try to riff on it, although it's a very, very specific case of a particular context. So I'm not able to give you a straight up answer. How do you do that for one material? But like we were discussing earlier, the reclassification of waste was critical in many cases of enabling industrial symbiosis. How people went about it was actually they went up to their regulatory agencies and asked for it. So they really engaged with the regulatory body, like, you know, in the UK, the Environmental Agency, and in other places, they have similar. So it's really by asking and engaging of what's the process for it and putting a case forward. So it wasn't, you know, there wasn't some sort of a mandate where this was done. It was very much bottom up where these things happened. And they were based on a like case by case scenario where something that was found, a waste that was found useful, people went and asked for it to be reclassified. I don't know if that answers your question, but this is what we figured in the process of how these things happened on the ground and technically. Basically, it was a proactive pursuit of this reclassification.
Yeah, so I can fill in a little bit more on that one. So this was the case that we did had most detail on was around the reclassification of Hessian sacks, which I know sounds a very bizarre thing, but they basically had become they were contaminated, and that was the problem, was the contamination on a Hessian sack. And as Doroteya is absolutely right. So the in fact, there was an intermediary who acted, and they did go to the Environment Agency to ask for the reclassification to take place. But that was because it was felt there was so much of these Hessian sacks to have become, you know, basically, otherwise they were just going to end up in landfill and become very polluting there. So there was a process that was around finding the right person to go and ask about reclassifying. But sometimes it's not very simple to do this because it's quite technical because of the chemistry. Quite often, you know, if you've got contaminating chemicals, in a product, or sort of bound within a product. As just as an aside, on another material, for example, in the car industry, a lot of components which come out of waste are highly contaminated with things such as talc and fiberglass, which means that they're extremely difficult to separate. And in order for them to become for example, plastics or rubber, where it's been contaminated, they are valuable inputs, but you have to find a way to be able to extract things, and therefore you have to extract before you can then reclassify. So sometimes it's quite tricky.
Yeah, sounds good. So I'll move on to the next question, which is basically, does industrial symbiosis have to be expensive, or can we find a strategic way for obtaining more favorable cost of implementation? It's a multifaceted response that we can offer here, and there are many factors at play. First, starting with the waste. Is it more expensive to produce it and dispose of it, or is it more beneficial to do something with it? Again, we said that the bottom of industrial symbiosis, we're talking about resource synergies. So where is the synergy? Where can you find the synergy where actually it is not expensive to do, as if you are doing it from scratch and on your own, but actually can you find a partner that can utilize that waste in a way that is mutually beneficial for both parties? So it's like any strategic decision, and it involves changes in how you do things, changes in the business model, creates opportunities, but also challenges with what comes in with new partnerships. But also, what is the cost of not doing anything is what needs to be considered. Like we said, some of their biggest triggers were actually really serious environmental problems being caused by production processes, or environmental legislation being imposed, or there was a very smart way of utilizing what was considered waste into new processes. So there's all of these things that need to be taken into place, and we have tried to provide some sort of assessing the opportunities as part of our selection of resource synergies, and also how you change your business model around a new opportunity, which is what we treat this to be, rather than a cost. And how you can mitigate the risk with implementing a new opportunity. Karen?
Yes, so the other thing I was going to say was, obviously the thing around cost is, traditionally, or typically, or classically, there was very low cost to get rid of waste, because you could just dump it into landfill or burn it. But of course, as regulations are tightening across the world, well, across most parts of the world, the cost has to be borne somewhere along the line. We just look at the sort of regulations around, the European Union and waste directives, where there has to be, companies have to pay to get rid of these materials, or they now have to pay to bring some of them back, having produced them. So we can see that this whole equation and the balance, as it were, is starting to shift towards that strategically it becomes much more desirable to do something with your waste, rather than just feel that you can offload it at no cost, because there will be a cost, and that cost will increase as time goes on.
I'll move on to the next comment. Greetings from South Africa. A comment rather than a question. Another piece of industrial symbiosis puzzle is to examine what is being imported. It would be great local benefit if imported products can be replaced by available local byproducts. And you're making a very good point. One of our cases was actually a new program for industrial symbiosis in South Africa, which is doing really, really well. We even had a PhD student doing a case study on this newly emergent industrial symbiosis program in South Africa, which was a sort of replicating what the NISP in the UK was doing very successfully, and more specifically engaging SMEs in the process of industrial symbiosis. Because when we talk about industrial symbiosis, we typically envision these large manufacturing sites and large organizations being able to take this on, but actually there's a lot of opportunity for SMEs to engage in this, and it's a great idea or a great opportunity to replace imported products with byproducts. It comes down to knowledge sharing, and where is the knowledge around the byproducts. So how do you tell the world you have this byproduct? Where do we find this knowledge? And it's a challenge in the process of not having a sort of regulated or some form of common shared understanding of the waste market, not only in Europe, but like across the whole world. So it will be a matter of investigating what byproducts are available and looking for platforms maybe, or cases or intermediaries that are operating in South Africa already that are doing this.
Also, I think one thing to add is where we've seen whole market or government regulations. I'm thinking really here about China, the banning the importing of plastic waste. So obviously, as that's closed down, sort of an external feed for the, well, one could argue that used to probably not go into feed stuff in China, but that's allowing probably the Chinese market to now use their own byproducts, which they generate locally. So we can see that there's also a governmental aspect to this as well.
Yeah. And I'll move on to the next question. During the project implementation, did you find examples of vertical symbiosis or horizontal symbiosis? What implications in terms of business model innovation of manufacturing industries? So what is interesting about industrial symbiosis, that we found examples of, bottom up and top down and middle up and down. So there was really an entry point. The entry point could be anywhere. And it did have implications for business models because you're changing the way you exchange value with your stakeholders in the network. And in terms of manufacturing industry specifically, like I said, if you look at our 25 case studies, we picked a range of industries to look into. So the principles, underlying principles apply to manufacturing industries as well, of course, with the specificity of the waste and things like that. But yes, business model innovation or a change of the business model is part of the adoption of industrial symbiosis. And we do have some suggestions for people engaging in that, for the path that they need to take in order to make it successful, and it's in our report. So have a look at our reports where we talk specifically about business model innovation, and we also offer some tools that can help you navigate the change in the business model while you're engaging in industrial symbiosis.
Yes, I think also just to add to what Doroteya has just talked about, when companies start to go along this sort of process in terms of developing industrial symbiosis, in a way they have to shift their business model, because it's really a very fundamental part of what they do. And sometimes they start it in a very small way, which is how they then gain confidence in terms of doing it. But as they build their capacity, it does mean that it enables them both to change the business model, and sometimes they have to change the business model because they have no choice but to do that. So that goes very hand in hand, those elements. That's what we found in our research.